look at Horace's The Art of Poetry today, and with it come to conclude the classical era in poetics before we move on to the appropriation of classical poetics by Christians and the transformation that ensues as a result of that. But one of the reasons I've been at pains to give a brief foray for at least a few classes in the classical period is the terminology, the ideas, pretty much the entire critical vocabulary comes from this period. Later writers will quibble over what the definitions mean, how they apply. They'll place the emphasis on different things than were there in the classical era. But I still think that the terms of engagement are forged in the classical era, and we can't get away from it. Modern critics will use the words like poem and poet, and we'll talk about a classic. They'll talk about genres and so forth. All of these terms come from the classical period. All the terms come from it, and their definitions come from it. And so when we want to use these terms without any understanding of the historical roots of it and background, I think we're not doing ourselves much of a service. And that is where, in most universities' discussions of literary theory, we begin at the end of a very long conversation as if we were the only people involved in the conversation. So it ends up being a monologue in which we define the terms and to some degree don't know that there can be a contrary position or a different one or maybe even a better one. Because again, because of the extreme folly of progressivism, we tend to think of ourselves at the top of the mountain. I've showed you that picture, looking out on all that we survey, assuming that we know better than the past without knowing the past. So it's a very hasty judgment, and I think in this case, probably a very foolish one. But we looked at Plato, first of all, and his discussion of poetry. And chiefly, we looked in Book 7 in his allegory of the cave, of the way he tries to describe what the poets currently do, which is to describe things very vaguely and falsely, for which reason he thinks that the moral equilibrium in whole states, remember it's called the Republic, in Greek the polis, and in individuals is misled because the poets appeal to our passions and our appetites, that lower part of human nature that is subject to things like pity and fear. So that's what the poets directly appeal to, and that's very attractive because most of us are moved by our passions. In fact, all of us are moved by our passions. But the question is, ought we to be? Ought we not to be moved by a better part of our nature, namely our reason? And that's Plato's contention, is that we ought to. And he explains this by appealing to the concept of justice in the Republic. You know, what does it mean to be just? And who understands justice the best? And who can make just people the best? Is it the poets, as we assume, or as our culture assumes, Homer and others? But he appeals explicitly to the idea of the passions being misleading, and particularly the passions of pity and fear. Pity, in this case, being something that the ancient world particularly despises, by the way. We don't get that because in the Christianization of terminology, we use a very different ethic. And we think that compassion for others is something that's laudatory. For the Greeks, to have compassion on your opponent is to be unjust in some ways. You're superior, they're inferior. Why should you be compassionate towards them? They have been defeated. You are superior. To show compassion for them is to bow to inferiority, to drag yourself down, and to not make the victor be the victor. And so there's a consequence to that, the treatment of those who are weaker than us, our enemies, slaves, children, women, you name it. There's an ethic and there's a consequence to that view of weakness. But the Greeks don't value weakness in any way. Now that gets transformed because of the gospel, because God himself condescends to be a human being, far below him, infinitely far below, really, a creature that bears his image but is mortal and sinful, and yet he takes on the form of a human being. And not only does he take on human form, that of a baby at that, when he grows, he is crucified on the cross naked in front of his enemies as a portrait of weakness. And so the ethics of the cross and the crucifixion transform our understanding even of certain concepts like pity and emotion. And today there's a lot of politics of empathy and compassion and guilt. All those terms are very much a part of contemporary politics, largely because of Rousseau in the Romantic era. But I'll get to that later on the course. But for here, we just have to accept that for the Greeks, pity and fear are things that they want to be mastered. You want to have no pity on what is not laudable. Don't feel compassionate towards things that are weak and are corrupt. Rather, get rid of them. And as far as your fear, you have to master your fears. It's Aristotle that says that bravery is the soul of all the other virtues because it leads them. If you have no bravery, it doesn't matter how just you are. You have to be brave. And bravery is required of the military man. It's required of everyone who wants to face danger. It's one of the chief moral features of human nature. And so they want to handle pity and fear by mastering them. Now, Aristotle, as we saw, disagreed with Plato in his contention that the poets ought to be banished from the ideal republic because he said that the poets in many ways did the exact same thing as the philosophers. They aimed for a universal, and they taught that, and they taught it in a form that was idealistic. And so Aristotle maintained in his poetics that poetic structures need to be beautiful. It's consistent in it. And I don't think I said this when I talked about Aristotle, so let me just talk about some of the features there of beauty. First is that it's unified in its presentation. He's talking specifically about the tragedy, but he'd say the same thing of the epic. It's unified in its portrait of things. It's not fragmented. It's not episodic, disconnected. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a sort of a unity to it all, but there's a beginning and an end, and the end is connected to the beginning. There's a coherence there. A lot of modern stories don't end. They don't have a purpose. They obviously begin because they have to begin somewhere, but they begin in a random order of the story. Well, let's just start it right here, like reality television. Okay, we're going to start filming. And we're just going to keep on filming. There's no ordering of the events that goes on here. Whereas in a great work of literature, there's a plot. It's the ordering of the events that is done for a certain purpose. Right? In Homer's Odyssey, he begins by looking at Odysseus's homeland of Achaea, what's happened to his house before then going to Odysseus. So he's looking, there's something very important being said there. He doesn't just begin with the Odysseys of Odysseus, he looks at his home and what's happened there before then going to him and then reuniting them and so forth. There's all sorts of a structure there, but there's a unity there that's beautiful. There's also a symmetry within that unity. Second feature of beauty, it's symmetrical. The parts are symmetrical with the whole. They just fit. And then finally, there's a proper length to it. An epic is a longer poem because it's a grander poem. It's trying to say more. Long narrative poem. A tragedy is briefer because a tragedy takes place in a single day. So the events are, obviously, if you're going to talk about events in a single day, you have to do a lot of background history to give you an understanding of what's happened, well, then you backtrack to it. But remember, we looked at Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king. It begins with the city of Thebes being destroyed by the god Apollo because of some terrible crime that had been committed. And the citizens of Thebes come to Odysseus and ask him to solve the problem, because he's already solved the problem in the past. He's obviously understands the will of the gods. He solved this riddle of the riddle of the Sphinx in the past, etc., etc., and so he can do it again. So it begins right in the middle of a crisis, and then he tries to resolve the crisis, which ends up backtracking to not only the history of the crisis, but to his own history. He doesn't think that the crisis is any relation to him whatsoever. As it turns out, he's the cause of the crisis, although he doesn't know it. And so it ends up being an exploration of his nature as much as the city's problem. So there's that sort of, again, that proper length, though. It's relatively brief. It can be performed on stage. A tragedy can be performed that way. So it's the right. So these three features of beauty, they all have a unity to them. They all have a symmetry of the parts, and they all are of the appropriate length. And a tragedy, in addition to being beautiful, is also very serious. And so Aristotle was essential to that, and Aristotle's poetics is of paramount importance to the classical poetics, because it really is the fountainhead of classicism in many ways. Even though he only hints at some things, others will develop on things that Aristotle said. He doesn't actually deal that much with the epic. I think chapters 23 to 26, which I didn't even talk about in class, very briefly accounts that he doesn't even get to lyric poetry. So even though it's called poetics, he primarily deals with tragedy, very briefly with epic, and then not at all with lyric poetry, even though lyric poetry is a significant part of the poetic tradition. But he is the sort of the key figure in classical poetics. Now, I said to you last time I was going to talk about Hellenistic poetics. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I think it's of far greater significance than is normally acknowledged, in particular in the critical terms that it gives to Horace. When Horace, the great Roman critic and really the chief representative of classical poetics, says what he says, he's drawing upon terminology that he has had bequeathed to him. He doesn't invent the terms. So between the time of Aristotle, like the 3rd century, remember Alexander the Great, his pupil dies in the 3rd century, and then Greece, which comprehends the whole of the known world, because Alexander goes all the way to India and he's all around North Africa. Everybody is brought under the sway of Alexander, and then he dies very young, dies of a fever, and his empire is split into 4 generals. But even in the time of the Bible, even though we're now in a Roman world, not a Greek world, everybody who's educated speaks Greek, and the New Testament is written in Greek. And that's really important. This is why I say the Greek classical era is of particular significance for Western culture and for Christian culture, because that is the context for Christ's incarnation. He comes to be born in the country of Israel, but that's just a little Judea, a little backwater of the Roman Empire. But the educated are still speaking Greek. And so the New Testament is also written in Greek. And that, I don't think that we can ignore that. It's significant. I never hear anyone talk about that. They say, well, the Romans are in power, and yes, they're in power, but they're still using the Greek language. And the Christian writers decide to write in Greek. They could have written in Latin. They probably knew some Latin as well, but they decided to write in Greek. It's Koine Greek, not classical Greek, but that's like a side issue almost. They're still writing in Greek, just like the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. So there's something significant being said there, and we need to give account to that. So in the Hellenistic period, the 3rd century BC to the 1st century BC, we see the idea of the classical literary terminology being further developed in the schools. It's no longer the center of gravity for the Greek world is no longer in Greece, though. It's shifted to places like Alexandria in Egypt, which then becomes a very important center for the Christian world, interestingly. And also places like Pergamum, mentioned in where? The 7 churches in Revelation. This is a center of Greek culture, literary culture. And other royal courts. So royal courts, because again, Greece is divided up into 4 different dynasties, and they all get overthrown by the Romans, but still the Greek influence is there. So Alexandria in particular is significant because it has the great library of the ancient world. And it also has a museum. The first use of the word museum, which is a derivation of Aristotle's Lyceum. That's what Aristotle's school is called. It was the Lyceum. In Alexandria, they have the museum. We still have museums. That's where we get the term from, the museum. And this is just a hotbed of literary scholarship in Alexandria. There's a whole school of interpretation that takes place there as well. And it's largely allegorical in its reading. Unlike Antioch, there's a school in Antioch, there's a school in Alexandria. That's a later development in the Christian era and so forth. How do we read scripture? Do we read it this way or that way? Christians end up leaning towards Antioch rather than Alexandria. But the Alexandrians tend to interpret everything allegorically. That's because their chief, they tend to be very much influenced by the Stoics, and the Stoics tend to allegorize Homer to get rid of the moral failings. So yes, he does portray the gods this way, but that's not what he means. It's just, we read this allegorically, not literally. And so they're purifying. It's a philosophical objection that Plato makes that they happen to agree with. So we still revere Homer, but we just read him to be doing something different than describing things literally. And in the Alexandria, they get into things that we call philology and grammar and textual editing and the history of literature. In German, they call it Literaturgeschichte. Doesn't matter. And we also owe our terms critic to the Hellenistic period, and criticism, furthermore. Those terms, the critic and literary criticism, those are Hellenistic terms that we use to this day. So the critic of this age is a scholar who dabbles in poetry and poetic theory. We don't have a lot of this period, but there's from this period, but we get some basic ideas from it. 2 in particular. One is the concept of a classic. The term the classic derives from this period. We talk about classical music, classical education, classical literature. Something that is particularly good, we just call it a classic, whatever its vintage. But the term emerges here, not from the classical era, but rather from the people that were reflecting on the past. They called this era the classic. It's a Roman word, by the way. Greek idea, Roman word. And secondly, the concept of genre emerges in this period as well. Now, this is implicit in the Poetics. When I say implicit, he talks about tragedy, epic, and lyric poetry, even though he really only deals with the first 2, and the second he doesn't spend much time on, and lyric he doesn't deal with at all. It's implicit. Genre is implicit in Aristotle's account. And what Aristotle is effectively also saying is that the eras that preceded him are exemplary and to be adhered to. The great age of poetry is not in the present, it lies in the past. So it's a backward looking and regarding the past in some sense as normative, not just great, but a model for future writing. So it's not an 18th century, it's not a contemporary understanding that the ancients were the superior, even in what we call the ancient world, that is even before the rise of Rome. We have an understanding already embedded in Western culture, or still in the Greek period even, that the greatness lay in the past, not in the present. The greatness was then, back then. And that emphasis you can hear echoed even in the great critic John Milton, the great epic poet John Milton, in his Treatise of Education, which some of you did with me, and some of you will do with me if you haven't done it, where he talks about the purpose of education to be to restore the ruins of our first parents, the aims of education. It's a recovery project. Where's the quote? The end then of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by gaining to know God aright and to recover what's been lost in the fall. Now, Milton's Christianized it, but it's still that same sense of there was something that was the pinnacle of human achievement in the past, and we've descended from that height. Now, compare that and contrast it with the modern view that I put pictorially on the wall. Where is it? This guy, right? We're on the summit of humanity, and we're looking out, and we're looking to nature, into the misty future, and the feelings within the poet, which we can't see even on his face, but we're thinking, what's he thinking there? Well, we can imagine because we're seeing the same thing as he has. But there's a sense of we're on the top of the mountain. Milton has it the other way around. The mountain lay in the past, and the mountain was the mountain on which Adam and Eve fell from grace and lost all knowledge of God, perverted everything through sin. And their knowledge, which would have been that of the greatest scientist and the greatest poet who ever lived, became corrupted and lost. It's the same sense you get in Tolkien, by the way. He talks about the original beginnings of things. Same in Lewis, for that matter, in Magician's Nephew. There's a terrific beginning, there's a fall, and then there's just an ever downward. Culture is going downwards, not upwards. This is modern progressivism posits the opposite. We're going up and further up and further up, and we're getting ever and more superior. We don't need to look to the past. We're going to look to the future. And the future, we might not see clearly what's happening, but at least we're not caught up in the errors of the past. We want to get rid of it. We want to move away from the past. This has the classical emphasis is very different. We want to recover the lost knowledge and virtue that was contained in the past. And the way we do that is going back to the first sources. So you can do that in various ways. But one of them is to try and recover Adam's language. I'm not going to get into all that. But a great move in the Renaissance to try and recover the original language of Adam and Eve. Lots of discussion about it in the Renaissance, by the way. What was the first language that Adam and Eve spoke? If we could come up with their terms, then we would name things correctly, and then we would have true knowledge, and with that, an ability to restore the ruins of our first parents. So let's try and recover Adamic language. What did Adam and Eve speak like? Well, we can posit that it was something close to Hebrew, but it can't be Hebrew either, because that's a fallen language. But it's the language of Scripture. So let's huge return to Hebraicism in the Renaissance world with this idea. Originally, the Renaissance in Italy is interested in Latin sources. Come the discovery of the Greek sources, there's a second reformation or return to origins, but now the origins goes not to the Romans, but to the origins, to the people that the Romans revered, namely the Greeks. And among Christians, even further back, let's go back to Hebrew. We have to study Hebrew. We have to study Greek. The Bible's written in those languages. Let's read those in the original. And there's something we're going to capture there of the original truth, which is going to be a liberating, no longer ideologically captured world. I'm just trying to visually in your mind represent this. So not this view at all. That's the view that our culture still, this is the idol of our culture represented right on the screen behind you. It's contrary to a classical view. It's contrary to a Christian view. If we're going to make progress, progress means getting closer to God. Where do we get closer to God? Where he's closer to us. Where is he closer to us? In his own word. So you get closer to him where he's closer to you. He comes closer to you when he reveals himself to you, not when you go looking for him in the misty distance in the forests of Muskoka or something like that. You're not going to find God there. He's going to find you wherever you are. Yes?
I was kind of wondering what the balance is between like valuing the past and the future, or like the present maybe. Like obviously we should value the past and learn from the past, but I think if we're always
stuck in the past,
then that's not always good.
How did I know you were going to say that?
Maybe that's just the language that I grew up with.
Of course it is.
But also, like, I think there is a value in just being present here.
Yes. No, this is the time and place that God put us in. So we can't live in the past. We need to learn from the past, but we need to learn what the past has to say about the present and then make the conversation. This is why classicism isn't about just reading old manuscripts and recovering. So if we all just speak Greek perfectly, somehow we've recovered Western civilization. It'll be a better place. That's absurd. It's absurd. Who actually believes that? There may be a few people, but they would be very unusual. But it's the substance of what's in those works that we need to retain and understand, and then we can move forward with that and then confront the world around us, believing there's truth in that past that will help us and is actually not given to us by people that simply assume that we are superior to everything that's gone before us without ever having read anything that's gone before us. So it's that both. You're not stuck in the past, but you're just including the past in the present conversation. It's part of the great conversation. But you have to have a conversation partner there. And that's really what, when we read Aristotle, Plato, we are to some degree just listening to their words, and then we're going to converse and we're going to use their terminology. That's the point of what I'm saying about the classics here. We're stuck with their terminology. Those are the terms of engagement. So we have to understand them, and then we can adapt them a little bit and think further about it. But let's start with, well, the terms didn't come from English. They came from this era. So the belief here in the genres, which we see even in Aristotle's Poetics, but now contained explicitly in this period, that in the classical age, that is roughly the 7th through the 5th century, when Homer is writing and when the tragedians are writing, this is the classical period, and it contains all the models of poetic excellence, all of them. That's the claim of the neoclassical era, or the Hellenistic period, not neoclassical, the Hellenistic period. All the models of poetic excellence are already there. So then we imitate them. But we don't just imitate them, we understand why those periods are as great as we can see that they are. So there's a backward-looking view that's enshrined in the official lists of works. And these official lists are called what? Canones, from which we get canons, from which we get the canon of Scripture. Those who talk about the canon of Scripture are using the vocabulary of the Hellenistic era, who was talking about poetics and not about the Bible at all. So we talk about the canon of Scripture. Today there's all sorts of dispute about the canon of literature, and they'll say, well, we just get that concept from biblical understanding. we don't have a canon of literature. That's just, we're appropriating a biblical term. No, the biblical critics are appropriating a Hellenistic term to describe genres of literature. So canons, that's the official list. And within the official list, well, there are 9 lyric poets, there are 3 tragedians, and there are 2 epic writers, Homer and Hesiod. Those are the canonical authors. They'll list them very clear. These are the canonical authors right here. Study their works. Canon is, as everybody who studies in Christian universities eventually comes across, means a ruler. They're the measure of everything that comes after. Do we measure up to that? That's how we will know we're great. We use them as the comparison. And then each poetic kind, so tragedy, lyric, epic, is broken down into other kinds. Special laws of arrangement and style and expression. So the great epic poet is Homer. The great lyric poet is probably Sappho, the female lesbian poet, Sappho. The great lyric poet of the ancient world is a woman, probably. Or maybe Alcaeus. It's certainly for love poetry. Archilochus for iambic poetry, a type of lyric poetry. Remember, there are 9 types of lyric poetry. And these get reinforced by subsequent writers. And Horace will be the one that will chiefly disseminate. As I say, he doesn't come up with the terms, but he disseminates them. People go to Horace and say, what does Horace say? Because Horace said it, he's an authority. But the authority doesn't come from him. It comes from those that came before him. And he will also lay down under 3 headings, 3 different ways of looking at literature. Let me write them down in the Greek. He talks about poiesis. He talks about poema. And he talks about poietes. So this is probably the art of poetry. This is the artifact, if you will. And this is the poet himself. These Greek terms are still used by later writers. Horace just used the Greek words, and they become the Latin words. But they're also used in the Renaissance, and they're also used in the neoclassical area, and they're also used by the Romantics. And on to the present day. We still use, if we want to get rid of poietes, we just say poet. Just drop the ending off it. And the poem, we've again dropped some of that, and poiesis we don't even use. Or we just keep it. But the art of making a poem. So poetic composition, if you will. So if you want to do, you've heard me disparage it, but creative writing. Note that we add creative to that. Important inclusion, the problematic inclusion, the creative writing, what's assumed in the word creative. Originality. But this is not originality. It's imitative of excellence that's already there. Don't think that you're the god. The gods have already spoken. Listen to them. You want to be creative? Imitate the greats. So poiesis has chiefly to do with the selection or invention and the arrangement of the subject matter. The subject matter that you choose or invent, or like as in bring into, that's already there and you'd bring into attention, and then you arrange it in terms of the plot, the structuring of it. That is the poiesis. What's the plot going to be? What are you going to choose to talk about and how you're going to arrange the plot? Homer decides he's going to write about the Trojan War. It's a great event in Greek history. It's also a great event in Roman history. It's also a great event in Carthaginian history. The three great peoples of the ancient world all around the Mediterranean, the three empires that fight for supremacy. Greeks are there first. They go down, and the Carthaginians and the Roman are left to fight over what's remaining, but all of them go back to Troy and the Battle of Troy. The Trojans that are defeated become the Carthaginians. No, they don't. The Trojans that are defeated become the Romans. Supervised by Juno. Going back to the battle way back in the beginning, an ancient myth. Which of the goddesses is the most beautiful? And a myth told at the end of the Iliad. You know the myth? Yeah. Which of the three, the god character by the name of Discord, Eris, there's a wedding, all the gods are invited. Eris, Discord, is not invited to the wedding. You wonder why. His character is to create disruption, disharmony. You want disharmony, disruption at your wedding? You certainly do not. He's angry at not being invited. So what does he do? Throws a golden apple in the midst of the goddesses. It says to the fairest, the three goddesses, Venus and Aphrodite, or actually Venus is Aphrodite. I'm going to confuse the Greek and the Latin. So Aphrodite and Hera and Athena are there, the three Greek goddesses. One represents wisdom, the other lust, passion, sex, and the third marriage, order, government. Which one is the fairest? They fight amongst themselves. How do we decide? That guy right there, we'll let him decide. Who's that? It's Paris. You get to decide. And guess what? If you decide in my favor, let me just sweeten the pot a little bit. I will reward you for your choosing that I'm the fairest. And so does he choose wisdom? Does he choose government? Or does he choose lust? He chooses lust. Thus begins the Battle of Troy. He chooses unwisely. He chose his passions. Go back to the whole lesson about what Aristotle and Plato are discussing about the passions. Don't let the passions lead you in anything. Here's the problem. We're always led by our passions. It's like a object lesson in human nature. Don't follow the passions. Oh, you do follow the passions. Well, let me school you better. That same lesson can get applied to biblical. Eve sees that the fruit's tasty, good for, as Milton portrays it. Just the smell alone would seduce you. But then she sees it's good for wisdom as well. And knowledge and government, all three features contained in the fruit. And then she eats it and everything comes apart. She loses control of everything because she can't govern her own passions, chooses to disobey God. Anyway, these terms come from this period and Horace talks about. So let me talk about Horace because I've spent a fair bit of time on the Hellenistic period and probably it seems disproportionate, but though I say that it is as important as it is because of the terminology that Horace assumes there, but he does build on that. So Horace, the great Roman author, is writing, and what's interesting here is that although the Greek terminology is there, we're now getting something like a Roman literary culture, which has developed. When Homer and the Greek great poets are writing, we're still to some degree in an oral period. Things are memorized and recounted by memory, not written down. They only get written down much later. So I think there's a tyrant called Pisistratus. I'm going to miss Pisistratus. He's a tyrant, Stratus. Tyrant in the 6th century. They're all different variations of Homer being recounted. And he said, let's have an official version. So he commissions that it be written down. It becomes a written text. There are all sorts of different texts. Let's have a single text, a bit like the King James Bible in some way. It becomes the authorized version of Homer. But it's a later version. And it becomes a literary culture then rather than an oral culture. Or the manuscript becomes clear. In this period, in the Roman period, it is already a literary culture. The oral culture is fading to some degree. They've lost the gift of memory. They need to things are written down. And we're thankful for that because scripture is conveyed to us no longer just in the memory of the original authors and those who've repeated their words, but it's written down for later generations. There's no changes allowed in this. This is the official text. This is the received text. This is the authorized version. And we think that there's a particular significance to it. So this is a literary culture, and that is the Roman literary culture. And we're transitioning from Greek influence to now Roman, and they're writing, the great writers, they are writing in Latin. So Virgil, the great epic Roman poet, is writing in Latin. Horace himself writes in Latin. He doesn't write in Greek. Although he would have studied Greek, he writes in Latin. Caesar writes in Latin. Cicero writes in Latin. This is the height of Roman culture. And he's writing in Latin here, as you can see, humano capiti cervicem pictor equinam. What if a painter in his art to shine a human head and horse's neck should join? Writing in Latin. And writing in poetry about literary criticism. Very interesting. Putting it to meter. Putting it to in a form that will be memorable. So he is very much of a Roman, and he has a consuming interest in people, and he is a very sharp wit, known for his satire, Horatian satire. People and manners, extremely influential in that respect as well. And he writes 3 major critical letters in verse, and we're looking at one of them here, the Epistle to Pisones, or Pisos, which is called in the tradition the Ars Poetica. Although that term comes from a later rhetorician by the name of Quintilian. Never mind. He doesn't call it the Ars Poetica. Quintilian, a later teacher of rhetoric, calls it this because he regards it as classical. Again, this is the definitive statement. Later writers say this. Quintilian, his judgment is accepted by others, etc. And he gives his fullest expression of poetry, and it is very much distilled and described Hellenistic poetics. But the air of the language is very much pictorial. It's very easy to read. It's very much like it doesn't sound like Aristotle. What if a painter in his art to shine a human head and horse's neck should join? From various creatures put the limbs together, covered with plumes, from every bird a feather, and in a filthy tail the figure drop, a fish at bottom, a fair maid at top. Viewing a picture of this strange condition, would you not laugh at such an exhibition? Trust me, my Pisos, wild as this may seem, the volume such, where, like a sick man's dream, fingitur species, ut nec pes nec caput uni. Why? So there it goes on into Latin. Never mind. And I'm not going to do that. Why is it going into Latin on me here? I think it just goes back and forth between the one to the other. Anyway, so he starts with a picture and an absurd picture. What if you just conjoined all manner of things and threw them together and created a creature out of that? What would that be other than an abomination? So there's no order, there's no proportion, there's no beauty, there's no symmetry. That's what would happen if there was nothing to guide you in how you were going to present things. So he begins with this. And in the first 45 lines, he's pleading for poetic unity. So he begins with an absurd. Let's start with the idea of unity, which I said was one of Aristotle's ideas. Let's start with a unified portrait, not apart from this creature and apart from that and apart from that. Let's have a unified portrait. And then the rest of this section, which goes on here, he treats his main interests, which are style and appropriateness. The word that he uses for appropriateness, which is echoed throughout the Renaissance in particular, is decorum. You ever heard that word? Sure have. That's his word. It's appropriate. It fits. Fits the unity. It has a symmetry. So decorum is the great word of Horace. And classical poetics in the Renaissance will regularly appeal to decorum. The right sentiments for expressing this are this. Today we talk about decorum in terms of manners, like the way we conduct ourselves. We'll talk about exercising the appropriate decorum. Here he's talking not about interactions on a personal level, but more about the right way of phrasing something to capture its essence. The two are totally related, by the way. The one's just the application of the other. If you want people to behave with decorum, you have to express yourself with decorum. That means you have to measure it. You don't just motivate their passions by being passionate. That creates all the wrong outcomes. Of course you can incite the mob. Really easy. Just appeal to their already inflamed passions. If Erica Kirk at her husband's funeral had said, go get them, there would have been a war instantly. The whole of the country would have been in flames. I assure you. That with the passions and the sense of sorrow and the sense of injustice, all that there, if she lights that, decides to vent and says, go get him, as opposed to I forgive him, totally different outcome. She exhibited decorum and Christian ethics and saying, no, not this. I'm going to follow the model of Jesus here. He forgives his enemies. They know not what they do. Don't think that everything in her didn't want justice in the sense of vengeance, but she restrained herself and said, no, that's not the way. That's decorum. Her speech reflected the decorum within her being. Very important. If you don't govern your tongue, you can't rule a city. It says that in Proverbs, actually. If you want to rule a city, you have to govern your tongue. It says it in James as well. Guard your tongues, James 3. And then goes on to say, if you don't, it's like hell. You let loose all of those things, which is exhibited in Virgil's Aeneid. That's what Dido does. She loses control. She loses her decorum, loses her restraint. So he's very interested in matters of style, appropriateness, or decorum. By the way, lines 46 to 98, if you're interested in that. He's interested in emotional appeal, lines that follow that. And he's interested in the faithfulness either to poetic tradition or to a type of character portrayal. All of them are backward looking. Fidelity to either the tradition itself or a character type, which he thinks are also fixed, by the way. There are certain character types which the Renaissance firmly believes and associates them further then with bodily composition. The four elements and how they conjoin in you, and they create certain psychological, what we call psychological traits, which you can study on your Myers-Briggs. Those things are there by nature. They come from some aspect of your being which differs from this person to that person. You can have twins and they can have different chemical. They look the same, but they're very different. Remember the nature and culture thing? These things fascinate us. But he sees that there's a certain types of character that can be formed and we can appeal to here in all this. So when he's talking about poetics, he seems to be talking about a great deal more than what we would traditionally associate with poetics. He's talking about humanization, what literature does to perfect humanity, how it appeals to us. So he will give all sorts of prescriptions for the dramatist. No need of violence on the stage, he says, which is maintained all the way to the present, actually, until the Romantic era, when suddenly they do, and certainly in modern films and TV shows, where they portray graphic violence all the time. Horace says if you do this, you debase the audience. Not just you desensitize them to it, you make them lose decorum. They're more prone to ignore the atrocity, or more prone to commit it, even worse. How many of these shooters and so forth play violent video games? It's not that one leads to the other, but it influences it, desensitizes. Just like the psychotropic drugs that they often are on, and the ideological craziness. I mean, it doesn't come from nowhere. So no violence on the stage. He says that in 180 and onwards, he said that on the stage there should be 5 acts, no more and no less. No more and no less. It should be a 5-act drama. Who follows that to the letter? Shakespeare. Where does he get it from? Horace. Doesn't Shakespeare set the template for English letters? No, he does not. He gets it from Horace. There should be 3 actors. If there are choral odes, they have to be germane to the plot. They have to be part of the unity and the symmetry. And there should be a proper length to it. All of these things he's getting that are implicit in Aristotle, he lays out for us. And his final charge is, when you're done your writing, polish, 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 polish. Don't stop polishing. Don't be in love with your original genius. Don't love your character so much that you can't kill them off. Nobody wants to kill off a character that they've created, that they comes to life, and they grow to love in some ways, or hate but appreciate, and don't want to get rid of them, but you got to kill them off maybe for the purposes of the story, or the moral of the story even. Shakespeare creates great villains. What happens to all Shakespeare's great villains? They have to die. We know that. They have to die. Otherwise, he's not a Christian dramatist, because he's not going to exhibit on the stage the teaching of justice that Christianity presents to us, which is that malefactors will be punished. Not just ultimately, but even in this life, there will not be injustice that carries on forever. It will last for a time, and it will seem to get worse and worse. So either it's going to resolve itself in a tragedy, all the bad guys are dead and some good characters along with them, or there's going to be a marriage at the end. But in either case, there's a resolution. There will be unity at the end, and justice in each case will be affirmed by the conclusion. So the conclusion is part of a unified, symmetrical, and properly constituted story. So that's how it's portrayed all the way up until the Romantic period. And then it flies in 100 different directions. I'm not saying there's these features of classicism entirely disappeared, but suddenly the fabric starts to fray, and it goes in different directions. The best dramatists still maintain this, by the way, and the best writers still have this sense. So classicism never dies. But sometimes there are alternatives out there that appeal to the passions, creativity, to originality, to chaos, that promise better. So polish, polish, polish. Rather than publish, publish, publish. Don't get it out first, get it out right. Great fault of the academy, publish or perish. Should be polish or perish. I don't care what you have to say until you've thought about it long enough that you can present it and not have to change your mind 5 years down the road. polish, 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 and if it's worth saying, then you publish. So the last section of the Poetics is related to this character, and this one's really significant. There's a great emphasis in the Romantic poets. When we look at Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, he devotes a great deal of time and attention to the poet and the character of the poet, which is really interesting, but just it's not original to Wordsworth. The character of the poet is going to be reflected. Last time we looked at what? Longinus on the Sublime, and he talked about what? He talked about nature and artifice, but he said the nature is the great, most important things. What is it? Greatness of thought, grandeur of thought, nobility of feeling. You have to have great thoughts and noble feelings. Focus on that. So now he's going to talk about that very thing here. Probably not having read Longinus, in fact, almost certainly not having read Longinus, but they just agree on this point. He's going to deal with the character of the poet and talk about his training, emphasis on moral philosophy, to which he points us to the Socratic dialogues. For a Christian, we could point better than the Socratic dialogues, or in addition to the Socratic dialogues, to Scripture. An intensive, lifelong engagement with the Spirit of the Holy God expressed in the Holy Bible. That's going to influence your character, because remember, you're going to teach and delight and move. Oh, I did say that. Horace said that. Let me repeat that. So, docere, delectare, movere. So teach, to delight, and to move. Let me just get that out of the way. So see it for a second. To teach, to delight, and to move. Horace says that this is what we're to do. The poet does this. Augustine will repeat these exact three terms and Christianize them, because Christian theology is the teaching will be about the person whose name is love, and delight will be in accordance with love, and we're going to move people to the motivated by caritas, charity, love for our audience. The love of God leads us to love our neighbor. How is that going to be expressed in the enterprise of teaching, delighting, and moving? Delighting, you could appeal to the passions, because that delights people. People delight in gore and pornography and violence. They delight in it. And they'll be taught by it. But what are they taught by violence? Hatred and destructiveness and chaos and disorder and disunity and ugliness. War is extraordinarily ugly. It causes post-traumatic stress for a reason. The hardest heart is traumatized by war. Look at Odysseus, long-suffering Odysseus. So the Christian Augustine, whom we will look at shortly, will repeat docere, delectare, movere when he's talking about teaching in the fourth book of his On Christian Teaching, citing Horace, but also citing the whole rhetorical tradition, because they all agree on this, that in entertaining, we're always teaching and moving people to do something. Because why? Aristotle says that human beings love to learn, and we learn by imitation. It's in our nature. For a Christian, you'd say, why is it in our nature? Well, because we're made in the image of God, is the answer. And God loves to create unity and symmetry in an appropriate fashion. He loves order. He likes things rightly differentiated. So the poet shall be trained with an emphasis on moral philosophy, so he needs to be of good character. By the way, Wordsworth will agree. Poet has to be of good character to create good poetry. Very interesting. So he is not far removed from the classical emphasis in thinking that this is the case. And his purpose will either be to profit or to please, or best of all, to do both. That's the best thing, to please and thereby to profit. But that's what a poet does. Based on his moral nature, which he's been taught by studying the Platonic dialogues, says Horace, he will then try to delight his audience based on the convictions of Socrates about justice and goodness and beauty, etc. He will then try to delight, and he will make a profit out of it. He will benefit from that financially then, in terms of patronage, etc. And he will need to be trained to get rid of his faults by having people criticize his work. The critic needs critics, or the poet needs critics. The critics are his best friends. They prune him of his own love of himself and everything that he writes. At the end of this, by the way, I'm not going to get, if you want to read to the end, he portrays the mad poet, which is pretty funny. Because poetry is a sort of a madness. It's a creative impulse. It's a whatever. It's an inspiration that doesn't want to be tamed. Don't know where it comes from. Don't know how, but it needs to be bridled and directed. And note that it's a poem itself. That's really interesting. There are a few instances of this in the critical tradition, that poets themselves write the best criticism in the form of a poem, but it's not normal. Alexander Pope tries to do it. What other phrases can we get from him that pass into the English language? A purple patch. Heard of a purple patch? No? It's a passage in a poem that's particularly memorable. It's sort of what Longinus talked about, the sublime. There's this, he writes book upon book upon book, but there's a period or a part of a book that he seems to be better than everything else. That's a purple patch. That's directly from him. He also gives us the phrases, we begin in medias res, referring to the epic. You begin in the middle of things. That's an R, by the way. He also gives us this is how I was taught to do it. Art is long. The acquisition of the art is long. Life is short. It takes a long, arduous training to be a great poet, and life is short. So you're racing against time to do something that is like climbing a mountain. The chief feature of Horace that later critics seem to admire is his brevity. He presents things succinctly. You can memorize what he writes here, and probably should. And in the Renaissance, they seem to know him by memory. They cite him in Latin, which they are still reading at that point. And what Horace does like no other is he convinces the whole of Western civilization that poetry is an honorable and highly exacting craft. You need to be a craftsman. And the poets are the greatest cultural figures, not the least, which the Romantics also believed, and now nobody believes, in part because of what the Romantics did to poetry. They took apart the unity and the symmetry, the proper length, with their appeal to the inspiration of the poet rather than the words of the poet, the spirit rather than the word. They severed those two. They exalted the spirit at the expense of the letter. But the letter is the art that prunes the nature. It constrains the nature. The Romantics always appeal to nature and attack art. You can't get good art if you get rid of art. And the Romantics themselves, ironically, are great artists, but their followers are not. All they are is expressive. Expressive individuals expressing their own nature, self-identifying themselves on the top of a mountain, asking everybody else to praise them for who they are and to recognize their greatness, etc., the greatness in our midst, etc., etc. So that's Horace's Ars Poetica. Do you have any questions? I tried to connect the whole first section of the course on classicism here. So there it is. This is us. This is a really flattering self-portrait. And anyone can fit into that picture. His back's turned to us. I think a really great way of, let's look at Renaissance. And let's just see what comes up under in Renaissance paintings. Oh, there you go. I mean, you name it. You could do the Mona Lisa here. Oh, that would be one. So she's front and center. I don't want to save it. There you go. So we could have that as opposed to that. Note that the triangular front and center is there, but note that we're looking at her, and especially this rather odd smirk, smile, whatever. The background is similarly this, but we're not looking at the background, we're looking at the foreground. The attention is focused on the foreground. What's front and center? Of course, that's the center of the Renaissance, the classical way of looking at things. It presents things front and center that are front and center. Our era is looking in the background. The front and center, which we are, is actually not front and center. It's what he's looking at, which is front and center. What we can't see in him is front and center. Our feelings in response to this background, that's it. So it's a very different thing, although it's presented in the similar triangular shape there. We get this from other Renaissance paintings as well. Well, School of Athens. What do we got there? No, it didn't work very well. There it is, front and center. What is it? It's Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle pointing up. Plato pointing up with his finger. No, that didn't work. But he's pointing upwards and Aristotle is pointing downwards. But they're front and center of the school of philosophy, the school of Athens. They're all littered around here, different types of philosophers. Same sort of triangular portraiture. Here we got the Sistine Madonna. You could almost use pretty much any Renaissance painting and you'd see the same thing. Oh, that's so small, I can't even see it, but there you go. But you got the idea. Triangular, the Madonna, the Bambini, or you get sometimes the Trinity. It's the triangle right in the middle. What you're looking at is at the front of the screen. What's in the background almost doesn't matter. That's the staging. But this is the structure of the plot. It's focused on what we're supposed to focus on. what we're focusing on is a person. It's a personal poetics. The romantic poetics is impersonal. It's focusing on nature, which is impersonal. It's idealizing that and the feelings of in relation to nature. We're going towards that. At this stage, it's still a humanistic type of poetics. It's about to become anti-humanistic once it goes to the romantic period and nature itself is idealized. Yes, hand.
One of the paintings that reminds me of this sort of scale is Daniel in the Lion's Den by Brittany Revere.
Okay.
The focus is on the lions, and it's a really impressive painting, but that's what comes to mind.
As a contrast to this, yes. I mean, everything that comes before this period is a contrast with this. Him turning his back on us is already revolutionary, almost in a literal sense. He's revolving. He's turning away from the past. He's standing on the hill, looking into the distance. We are looking at what he's looking at. We're no longer looking at him. We're looking at what he's looking at. We can be in his place, and literally we are in that position. We aren't looking at the greatness of the artist to guide us. We are the greatness. Done for today.